Okay, hello everybody. Well, hello. Welcome to today's colloquium, which is in the form of a book discussion panel. But before the panel starts, I have a couple of announcements. Next week, Tony Badger, professor of American history at Northumbria University, will be giving a three-part lecture entitled Why White Liberals Fail, Southern Politicians and Race, 1933 to 2018. There are posters near the door which will tell you the dates as well as the locations. Next week's colloquium will be delivered by Jarvis Givens. He's an assistant professor of education here at Harvard, and he'll be speaking on fugitive pedagogy in the Jim Crow classroom, the case of Carter G. Woodson. Now, the book discussion will be led by Paul Kaplan in lieu of David Bindman, our fall fellow whose arrival has been delayed. Paul Kaplan, however, is a former Du Bois Fellow and also a distinguished art historian. He's professor of art history at SUNY at Purchase College, and he has published widely on Blacks in Renaissance Italian art, is a major contributor to new editions of the image of the Black in Western art. He's the author of The Rise of the Black Magus in Western Art. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Either way.
Okay. And of numerous essays on European images of Black Africans and Jews, and on political, military, and feasting imagery in Venetian art. His current work includes research on the role of Black Africans in Venetian art and society, the changes in European images of Black Africans around 1600, and the intersections of race and art in the writings of 19th century American and British visitors to Italy. And this material will be the topic of a book forthcoming from Penn State Press. Please welcome Paul Kaplan to the podium.
Thank you, Krishna. I'm very happy to be here. I'm sad that David Bindman is not here, as he is the very emblem of the image of the Black in Western art as an ongoing project. But I'm happy to step in for him because my own affiliation does go back a little way, and my interest in the project and in the Menils goes back 30 or 40 years at least. It's my honor to introduce our guest, William Middleton, today at the Du Bois Research Institute Fellows Colloquium. I've been associated directly for more than a decade with the Image of the Black in Western Art series, which goes back to the 1960s, when, as a response to segregation, Dominique de Menil, and we learn in the book to some degree Jean as well, launched a research project and photo archive of images. Decades later, thanks to the initiatives and labor of Henry Louis Gates Jr., Karen Dalton, and David Bindman, and of course, Harvard University Press, the series has been revitalized into a set of vivid volumes tracing the Black image across time and across the globe. Double Vision, the unerring eye of art world avatars Dominique and John de Menil, is a much anticipated, much needed biography of the principal movers and patrons of not only the Image of the Black in Western Art project, but also many, many others that have influenced the course of art history, politics, and countless lives of individual artists and their audiences. Art News's enthusiastic and extensive review of the book is entitled A Moral Obligation in William Middleton's Double Vision, a superb portrait of Dominique and John de Menil, patrons who funneled oil fortune into art and social justice. And indeed, I can attest that Double Vision is an amazing, meticulously researched, elegantly written story of a couple, but much more than just the couple themselves. It spans Europe, Latin America, and the US, centuries of absolutely absorbing family history, and the worlds of activism and art that the de Menils inhabited and brought together through their work and their lives. William Middleton came to this project as a writer from the top echelons of European and American writing on style and fashion. Born and raised in Wichita, yet well-traveled due to his parents' interests and efforts, he later trained as a journalist at the University of Kansas. His first jobs were with such publications as Connoisseur and Metropolitan Home, the award-winning modern design magazine, for which he also served as the Paris city editor. Before too long, he was the Paris bureau chief for Fairchild Publications, overseeing Women's Wear Daily and W Magazine, and then the fashion features director of Harper's Bazaar, which brought him back to the States in New York City. He's freelanced for Vogue, Travel and Leisure, and the New York Times Magazine, among many other important publications. While he had known about the Menil collections and commissions for some time, it was his 2001 Harper's Bazaar article on Houston, where the de Menils had lived, and one might almost say reigned, that led him finally to John and Dominique de Menil themselves. He was fascinated by them, their life trajectories and missions. Double Vision was on the horizon. I'll let William tell us much more about his 10-year exciting journey of research and writing that led to this remarkable, epic volume. And I do hope he will give us at least a hint as to what he will be tackling next. So I'll just tell you a bit about the structure. William's going to give a presentation, should be about 15 to 20 minutes. Then Karen will introduce herself. I'll introduce myself just in a little more detail about my background. And then we'll proceed to a back and forth up here, and we'll, of course, take questions from the audience. Thanks. Please welcome William Middleton.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It is such an honor to be here, and a privilege to be focusing on this part of the de Menils' lives. What I really wanted to talk about today is the de Menils and their fierce, decades-long engagement with civil rights. So, Dominique and Jean de Menil are best known for an institution in Houston, in Texas, called the Menil Collection. And I don't know how many of you know it, but this is a museum that opened in 1987. This is designed by Renzo Piano. And before I really talk about their engagement with civil rights, I want to explain a little about this museum. So the de Menils had been collecting works of art since the 1930s, and in the 1980s, Dominique decided to build a museum to house their collection. There were over 10,000 works of art at that point. She hired Renzo Piano, who was a young architect who had never built a new building on his own, never done a building in the United States, and she hired him to do this. It opened in June 1987. It has these incredible leaves of ferro cement that filter out 99.5% of the harsh South Texas light. It has a 300-foot long central corridor, dark floors, and this remarkable collection of art. And I just want to give you a sense of some of the concentrations. This is the antiquities section. It begins with the little piece on the left is a Paleolithic bone carving from 20,000 BC of reindeer. It's really rare that a museum goes all the way back to the beginning of man. Greco-Roman, tremendous concentration on non-Western art, specifically, or especially African. These are some of the African galleries built around a tropical courtyard. There are over 1,000 pieces of important works from Africa. These are some of the Oceanic galleries, again, built around a courtyard. This is the Surrealism. These are the Surrealism galleries. It's the most important collection of Surrealism art in the world. They have over 100 paintings by Max Ernst, over 60 paintings and sculptures by Magritte. In these galleries, the lights have been blocked out, the skylights, the walls have been painted gray to increase the sense of mystery. And then these are the 20th century. So you have Braque, Miro, Matisse, Picasso. An amazing thing about the museum is there are no wall panels, no descriptions of what you're to see. There's nothing but a little label that says the name of the work of art, the date, the medium, a donor if there is one, because Dominique didn't want anything that interferes with the way that you experience a work of art. It should just be you in front of a work of art deciding what you think. The bookstore is in a bungalow across the street. There's no cafe. Dominique said no bookstores, no blockbusters, you know. And the founding director of the museum even told me, and it's super interesting, that even the name of the museum, the Menil collection, is written in letters that are affixed to the outside of the glass of the building. You know, so there's nothing inside except for a work of art. You know, so it just gives a sense of their appreciation for a work of art. So to give you some idea of who they were, Dominique Schlumberger, that was her maiden name, came from one of the most important Protestant dynasties in France. They'd been prominent on French oil for centuries before she was born. Her great-great-grandfather founded a company called Nicolas Schlumberger and Company that still exists. That's one of the world's great manufacturers of textile machinery. So they already had quite a fortune, but to be Protestant in a profoundly Catholic country like France is very meaningful. The Protestants were actually known for having a great sort of social conscience. They were some of the first who fought for the abolition of slavery. They were the first who fought for the vote for women. And they were some of the most committed members of the resistance during World War II. So Dominique already has kind of a heritage of social conscience. She's a member of an industrialist and an intellectual dynasty that goes back for generations. Her father was a professor who taught physics, Conrad Schlumberger. He had this idea that he could use electricity to measure what lay below the ground, right, before World War I. And so while she's growing up, he's doing all these experiments. She's out in the fields with him, traipsing around, and it turned out that it worked, that he could take these subsurface readings, and the idea was to prospect for minerals like gold and precious minerals. And then it turned out after the war that it worked, and it turned out that you could use it to find oil. And then, not immediately, but fairly quickly, it turned out that anytime anyone, anywhere in the world drilled for oil, they used Schlumberger. So it became the world's largest oil services company. It's still about 120,000 employees, $25 billion in annual sales. They're the kind of, as I see them, the white hat of the oil industry. They're the kind of scientists of the oil industry. So the family went from having a fortune to being incredibly rich. Jean de Menil came from a much different family, Catholic, royalist, conventional, conservative. Around the time that he was born, his father, in order to protect the family name, honored the debts of a distant relative and essentially bankrupted Jean's family and his cousin's family as well. And so he grew up in really difficult financial situation. His two older brothers were killed during World War I. So Jean de Menil became the person on whom the future of the family kind of rested. And from a very early age, he was much more interested in sort of the modern world than other members of his family. And he was much more interested in the outside world. When he was in 1924, 1925, when he was 20 and 21, he took a trip around the world. There were 7 students selected from the leading universities in France. And Jean de Menil represented Sciences Po, where he went to school. It was a tremendous honor. And for over 6 months, they went to Egypt, Africa, Ceylon, Madagascar, Australia, Tahiti, and then through the Panama Canal. And, it could be seen as somewhat a colonial gesture, these men from the these young men from the leading universities in France. But Jean de Menil saw it, very differently. This is what he wrote about what he saw in Sri Lanka and Tahiti. He said, white men, with the superiority afforded them by steam engines, vaccinations, and gunpowder, wanted to demolish everything without so much as a second look. Fortunately, the missionaries and the different kinds of people who followed them in colonialization have not yet destroyed everything. So he saw the nobility in these cultures that he saw on his trip around the world. And these were some postcards that he brought back from New Caledonia. That was him on his honeymoon, wearing something that he picked up there. These are one of a pair of bark claws from New Guinea that were one of the first items that Dominique and Jean, one of the first works of art that Dominique and Jean bought in 1932. And they were the first works that were ever in a museum. So immediately they're interested in the outside world. They're interested in non-Western art, which is not something that everyone was at that point. So this is their apartment in Paris. After they had renovated, it's just one corner of the living room. Doesn't look as nice as it actually is, but it's a little curved sofa that was done by a modern architect and some low bookcases. And then on the left is a Russian Orthodox icon of St. George slaying the dragon. And on the right is a piece by a contemporary French artist named Christian Bérard of Othello. And so these are essentially, these are the first two paintings that the Dominials purchased. And it's super interesting to me that they're not serious collectors at all, but right off the bat, they're buying a work of an Eastern Christian painting and contemporary work of a person of color. So the Dominials went to the United States during World War II, or they left for the United States during World War II. The fear was that Schlumberger would fall into Nazi hands, and so they closed the company in Paris, and Houston, Texas, was the American headquarters of Schlumberger, so the Dominials went to Texas. Then they went to South America. They spent most of the war in Venezuela and in Trinidad, where the major operations were down there. And at the beginning of their stay, they were in Buenos Aires, and they met someone named Pierre Verger, who was a French person, a photographer, and they enjoyed him. They went around to kind of the dive bars in Buenos Aires and all of that. It was something that Jean de Menil would have liked to have done. And he mentioned to them that he felt, he was a photographer working for magazines, a lot of French magazines, and he mentioned that he felt like there wasn't a lot of interesting work for him to photograph in Buenos Aires, that he would really rather photograph the indigenous people of South America. And so it was just mentioned in their night in the town, and then 5 months later, they got a check from the Dominials funding a 6-month-long journey for him, and he published a book in 1945 called Festivals and Dances in the Cuscos and the Andes, and it was dedicated to the Dominials. And Pierre Verger went on to become one of the most important ethnographic photographers in South America. And there's a center, he has a center in Bahia, Brazil. He really focused on Afro-Brazilian people. And the person who oversees that center explained to me that this book is not very well known, but it was super important in his career because it was the first time he did, any kind of anthropological work. And so, it's a small incident, but it's the first example of the Dominials' patronage. And these are some images from the book. It's a terrific book published in French and Spanish and English. And I think it's fascinating that the Dominials' first example of artistic patronage was something that had such a profound impact on the subject. So this was a painting that Dominique and Jean commissioned from Max Ernst when they were redecorating their apartment in Paris in the 1930s. They wanted to have some murals done for their dining room. They heard that Max Ernst painted birds, and so they went to his studio and they saw the kind of birds that Max Ernst painted, which were pretty scandalous. And Dominique said that they were a little shocked and they didn't want to buy one of his birds. And Jean said, well, what if we have him do a portrait of you? He saw a portrait that he had done there. So they commissioned him to do this portrait of Dominique, and they received the portrait, or they saw it finally after she went for some sittings, and they didn't like it. And then it was sent to the framer, and they forgot about it, and it was at the framer for like 2 or 3 years, and finally someone else saw it and gave it back to them, and they hadn't seen it for 2 or 3 years, and they still didn't like it, right? And so they kept it wrapped in paper and put it on the top of their armoire and forgot about it. And it was there for 15 years, all during World War II. And when they came back after World War II and after their experience in galleries in New York and museums of New York, really looking at contemporary art and really understanding what modern art was. They saw this painting in a completely different way, and they understood sort of what they had. And Dominique always told that story as an example of, you can be educated. You don't have to have, you don't have to understand immediately what great art is. And so they really became collectors, serious collectors in the United States after World War II. And something else that happened was they experienced, particularly in the South, segregation. And as Dominique wrote at that time, or excuse me, as Dominique would later describe it, she said, "The segregation law was inhuman. Slavery was not so far away, and the threat of lynching was always hanging over any black male. I felt that the situation was intolerable, and as a French woman, I should contribute something." So from the beginning of their time in the United States, particularly after World War II, from 1945 on, they became committed to a fight for civil rights, and it took many different forms. And I want to focus today on some of the forms that are more artistic in nature. They began collecting non-Western art, as I mentioned with the Bart clause from New Guinea, but they really started focusing in the 50s on art from Africa. And they assembled throughout the 50s a fairly important collection of non-Western art, and specifically works from Africa. In 1959, there was a new building that was built in Houston, the Museum of Fine Arts. It's designed by Mies van der Rohe. It's an incredible building. There was an exhibition of art there, the first exhibition that was not good. It wasn't up to the level of this incredible building. There was someone who the Dominials worked with named Jerry McKagy, one of the first great women museum directors in the United States. And they worked with Jerry McKagy to curate an exhibition called Totems Not Taboo. And the title is John de Menil's. The Dominials paid for everything in this exhibition, and it is over, it's not just African pieces, but there are over 230 major works of primarily African sculpture. And they built these incredible structures within the space with these kind of white walkways. They used gravel, plants. The director of the Museum of Modern Art, René Darnancourt, was down, and he said it was one of the 3 most exceptional exhibitions he'd ever seen in his life. And what's extraordinary to me about this exhibition is not just the quality of the work, but that it's taking place in 1959 in the segregated South, right? There was a really important social component of this exhibition for John de Menil. He worked with people around the United States and in Africa to get these works here. He could not be at the opening, and Dominique, this is her at the opening night of the show, and she sent him a telegram, and the last line was "nail hit this time," because it was important for them artistically, but it was also important as a social statement. This was showing the nobility of African art in the segregated South. And there was no, I'm so struck by it. There was no exhibition in New York of this quality. There was no exhibition in another American city of that level. And this is, in the South, just up the road in Little Rock was when they were rioting at the high school. It had been just a question of 5 or 6 months before, I guess. And so here in the South, they're making this really strong statement of civil rights. So really important to their connection and their engagement with civil rights was their relationship with Mark Rothko. They bought their first Mark Rothko painting in 1957. It's this one, the Green Stripe, from 1955. They, in 1960, visited him at his studio on the Bowery in New York, and he was working on his paintings for the Four Seasons. That ended up not going to the Four Seasons, and the Dominials immediately felt a sort of spiritual connection with his work. As Dominique said, she felt that they should walk softly and whisper, that these kind of big abstract paintings had a sense of spirituality to them. And in 1962, he was working on the murals that he did for Harvard. And someone, when they saw them, said, they're so extraordinary that, we should build a museum just for your work. And he said, actually, a chapel, So he had been thinking for a long time that there should be some sort of religious context for his work. And in April 1964, the Dominials commissioned him to do paintings for what would become known as the Rothko Chapel. They rented a studio for him on East 69th Street in New York. This is him. And the paintings were completed 3 years later, and there are 14 enormous panels. This is the chapel. The building itself was done by Philip Johnson, although he eventually had to drop out of the project because he and the artist had a disagreement, and the Dominials always sided with the artist. And they placed in front of the museum this extraordinary sculpture by Barnett Newman. It's called Broken Obelisk, that John Dominique initially wanted to buy in 1969, wanted to help the city of Houston buy in 1969 and have it dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. And the city didn't want that. And John Dominique, this was the year after he was assassinated, and John Dominique went to the city council to plead, to make the case for why this should be in a prominent position in Houston and dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. And they chose not to, and they wouldn't explain why. And there was a story that sounded so good to me that I wasn't sure it could be true, but eventually I found it in a letter that John Dominique wrote to the artist saying once the city council had turned him down, he proposed an alternate inscription, he said, which they also didn't accept, which was, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." So John Menil is a very forceful person, and this is the positioning of Broken Obelisk in a reflecting pool that was chosen by the artist in front of the Rothko Chapel and dedicated, of course, to Martin Luther King Jr. And the chapel is an octagonal chapel with nothing but 14 large and not easy dark panels by Mark Rothko. It is a non-denominational chapel. Dominique called it a no man's land for God. It's open to people who believe in anything or nothing. It's a place of meditation, but it's also a place that is committed to civil rights and to human rights, which I'll talk a little more about later. But the Dominials, and it's fascinating to me because the Rothko Chapel is this place of meditation and spirituality and very kind of a very sort of meaningful place. And there's this exhibition called Some American History, which was a very controversial exhibition overseen by Larry Rivers, who is a white artist from New York. And he worked with quite a few African American artists to do an exhibition that explored the black condition. And it's controversial in that like one of the main works is called, it sort of says it all in the title, is a Caucasian woman sprawled on a bed and 8 figures of hanged men on 4 rectangular boxes, 1970. So it shows lynching, and it's around a woman on a bed sprawled, a white woman on a bed sprawled, because that is often the justification for lynching. It was a really tough show, and what I didn't understand immediately is this show opened the same weekend that the Rothko Chapel opened, and it's not accidental, They opened this incredible place of abstract art and contemplation and spirituality with this very kind of in-your-face exhibition that was scandalous for a lot of people. So later that year, the Dominials took over a theater in Houston called the Deluxe, which was in a rough part of town, and they spent 6 weeks working with a variety of volunteers and contractors. The man on the right in the striped pants is someone named Mickey Leland, who became a congressman from one of the first African-American congressmen from Texas. And the Dominials believe very strongly in, were great friends with, and they worked with a curator and artist from New York, shown here with John Dominique, Peter Bradley, who selected 19 leading white and black contemporary artists, and they installed 40 works of art, mostly abstract and color field paintings and sculpture in this space. There were over 5,500 visitors in 6 weeks, which in a place that had never seen an art exhibition was pretty extraordinary. The Houston Post said, study and contrast, Lyons Avenue and lyrical abstraction. And the idea, again, it was not, and then after that exhibition, they continued with something called Tribal Art of Africa. And so they turned the Deluxe show into an exhibition of the Menil's African collection. And an art historian from TSU, which is the historically black college in Houston, said of this exhibition, it was like a wordless introduction for African Americans to a past they could now celebrate. So the context in Houston was not easy. This is in 1979. This is some racist graffiti that took place in, actually this is in January of 1980, but in December of 1979, this racist graffiti was scrawled on Broken Obelisk just the night before they were to have a human rights celebration. And this is in January of 1980 at the annual celebration for Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. They had a sort of vigil around it. So the context in Houston is not easy. It's the South. And this is still, in the 80s. But the Menils persisted, and as I said, the Rothko Chapel really became the center of their activities for civil rights and human rights. This is the Harlem Boys Choir on a celebration for Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. They brought the Dalai Lama there, whirling dervishes inside, outside. She started a prize with Jimmy Carter, the Carter Menil Human Rights Award, and they brought important civil rights and human rights leaders from around the world to Houston and celebrated them. Archbishop Tutu was one of the first, and then this is in 1991, the 20th anniversary of the Rothko Chapel, an event that was one of the most important for Dominique de Menil, when Nelson Mandela, certainly shortly after he was released from prison, came to Houston to celebrate with Dominique and Jimmy Carter. So I just want to conclude, and there are so many different ways that I could talk about civil rights. I could talk about their personal relationship, but today I've tried to focus on their connection with civil rights as an art, the connection with the art of civil rights. And this is a painting that is by an English artist named Sir Joshua Reynolds. It's called A Young Black. It was, the date is 1770. And in October 1983, it was up for auction in Paris. It's, Sir Joshua Reynolds is a really important English artist. It was a work that's unfinished, but was really important for the artist. He always kept it in his collection. He never sold it. When he died, it was still in his collection. And then it went through a variety of owners, and in October 1983, it was up for auction in Paris. And Dominique sent a representative to the auction, and she ended up getting it. So he called her from Paris. She was in Houston to say, we got it. And I think that there was an underbidder named Charles de Bistigui, who was a famous kind of collector in Paris. And, great, but Dominique wasn't too concerned about the underbidder. And then a week later, she got a phone call from Michel Leclerc, who's the director of the Louvre. And he said that Charles de Bistigui was, in fact, the underbidder, and that he was preparing to buy this work and to give it eventually to the Louvre. And that Michel Leclerc, the Louvre director, felt that it was too important a work to leave France, and that he was prepared to block its export. And Dominique said that, first of all, the Louvre has so many beautiful pieces of painting that one more really doesn't make that much of a difference. And that for a collection such as hers that concentrates on the black experience, this is a key painting in a way that it isn't for the Louvre. And Dominique de Menil wrote in her date book, très gentiment, il s'incline, which means, very kindly he bowed down, literally, but it means he conceded, And I love this story because, first of all, it's not been known. It was just in Dominique's date books, which no one ever saw, and because it would have been impolite for her to sort of brag. But also, it's an example of her going, toe-to-toe with the director of the Louvre and winning. But it also shows how important works of people of color are to Dominique de Menil and how important they are to this collection.
to the sale that the prices would go up. So I don't even remember.
You know, they're so weird about costs at the Menil collection that I've seen that price, but I can't remember. There are very few times that and it's a shame too, because so many of the costs it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Is that probably Francis Barber?
Excuse me?
He's Francis Barber. He was Samuel Johnson's servant.
Yeah, actually, it is. Yeah, is that true?
Mm-hmm.
There's debate. It's just debate. Yeah. Some people think that. Yeah. There's not a photograph of Francis Barber, so nobody knows.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great, fabulous.
Thanks.
Karen, could you say a few words about the history of your affiliation with Madame de Menil and the project?
Gladly. I first met Madame de Menil in 1971. I had known of the de Menil because my husband at that time was a graduate student at Rice in urban design. And after he graduated, Bill Lacey had asked him to come to the National Endowment in Washington to work with him. The relationship, clearly there was something badly wrong with the relationship. And so one day I stayed home from work and called my friend Olivia in Houston and said, "Would you pick me up at the airport tonight?" And she said, "Yes, I will." And Birch came in and I said, "I don't know what's wrong, but I know you're not happy with me, and I'm leaving." And 2 days later, Bill Lacey calls me from the endowment and says, "Is there anything you need?" And I said, "Well, a job wouldn't hurt, right?" And he said, "Well, let me make a phone call." And he called a friend of his, who was Rowland Scott, I can't remember his last name, I think, but asked him if he would set up a meeting for me with Madame de Menil. And so 2 days later, my friend Olivia, who picked me up at the airport, took me to meet Madame de Menil, and she and I talked for a long time. And at that time, Jean was already sick. And he was still mobile at that time, and he came in close to the end of our conversation and was clearly not really very impressed with me. I didn't have a PhD, I didn't even have a master's, and I wasn't an art historian. So when I left, I thought, that's not going to work because he really didn't like me. And then an hour or so later, Madame de Menil called me and she said, "Could you come back out to the house?" And I said, "Yes." Olivia got in the car, drove me back. And when I walked in, she said, "Can you leave for Paris in a week?" And I said, "Sure, I can arrange that, but why?" And she said, "Well, we have this office. We've been doing research led by a young French art historian and his wife, and I want very much for the project to have a real life in the United States, and so I'd like you to go and train with them for 3 months, and then come back and set up the office here." So 3 months became 6 months, because during that time, she and Jean sent a pair of photographers called Hickey and Robertson to photograph works in Paris. And she came to Paris and she said, I'd like for you to go with me to the Bibliothèque Nationale. And I said, okay. Why are we going? She said, I'm going in to see if I can't get permission for Hickey and Robertson to photograph there. And it was this long, long, long staircase. Walked up and into the office. And it was the head of the Bibliothèque Nationale, and he did everything but get out and grovel. It was really quite a display of thinking that she was going to be endowing something for them. And so we left, and we're walking down the staircase, and I said, I don't understand how you tolerate that. You just absolutely did everything but get down on the floor, and grovel at your feet. And she said, I knew it meant I was going to get exactly what I wanted. So that was, but she could both have enormous humanity, but then being really cold if it was called for. So.
Can you explain too how the project began?
Yeah, although maybe Karen could say some words about the prehistory before you came in, and I could supplement a little bit maybe.
Well, I don't. As I said, she had hired this Ladislas Budenel and Monique Budenel to begin the research. And what they did was to go. The first thing that Ladislas did was to go to the British Library and start. And because he went to places that had large collections of images, and he literally went through them one by one, and began to
Print collections, presumably early on, because it would be an easy compendium to go through.
Well, no, but they had photographs of
just
works of art.
Just the entire, yeah.
Yeah. So, went down, you couldn't click through, right? I mean, they were.
Because, just to say another word about this, because this was around the same time, the late 60s, early 70s, that I was beginning to get into this field, there were very few compendia of images in European or North American art that selected out images of people of color, right? So I remember summers when I was working on a sort of honors thesis in college, where you go into an art library and you just start taking books off the shelf, and page by page, and by the time you get to the end of some 17th century painter, you'd have 3 or 4 things to put in your folder. Now, I was doing that in a very primitive way, but this project was doing it in a highly professional way, but it was still incredibly tedious.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they didn't quite know what they were going to do with it either. The idea was let's see the way people of color have been depicted in art over the centuries, and what will it be? We don't know. Is it a research project? It wasn't clear initially that it would be a publication or a series of books, as it became, and so Ladislas Budenel was hired in Paris in 1960. In 1961, the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston was sending letters out to museums around the world and collectors saying, can you send us slides of any images or any works of art in your collection that depict people of color? And so they're accumulating all of these images and slides, and then this important moment, I think, that came just before, I believe, you were hired, when the Paris office had all of these images gathered, and they had done some photography, and they showed it to Jean de Menil, and he looked at it and he said, it all has to be redone.
Yes, this won't do it all, right?
It has to be redone by these photographers who we work with in Houston, because at that point they knew that it needed to be a publication, and Jean de Menil felt that it was not a research project. It was a project that needed to be a beautifully produced publication, And one of the things that I loved when the first volume was published 16 years after they began, right, in 1976. And I mentioned this the other day, but John Russell in the New York Times, the art critic, said of the first volume, it has the kind of stately and illimitedly gorgeous presentation that is usually preserved for the white man's glorification of himself. right? So that was important. That was John de Menil's decision.
But
you
there
know.
was a kind of agenda, I do think, and
Oh, I
Karen
see.
can speak to this as well. So that in a sense, it was about people of color, but it was also about trying to identify a thread in Western culture that exalted them.
Yeah.
And that was, I think that, from what I've heard at least, that's what sort of pushed the project, into existence at some level. That if we could find the works, and there was a presumption it would be the works by the greatest artists, would be the most impressive examples. And that in some way would validate the integrity of people of color and their culture, but I think behind it also there was a sense that it would validate a certain strand, at least in European culture, in Western culture.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little more about that?
Well, you'll appreciate this. I remember early on, I went with her to the Metropolitan to see someone who I won't name, and one of the first things he said to Madame de Menil was, why not Jews instead of black people? Right. I mean, that was, but as an indication of how perfectly absurd he thought it was.
That would have been a good story for the book.
Or how random, yeah, how,
But so.
Do you want to say a few words about the transition from the Menil Foundation into Harvard's pickup of the project? I mean, I think it might be interesting to talk about the sort of the final elements of her investment in the project and how it ended up here.
Well, Skip obviously had a whole lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Because Madame de Menil and I had gone together to, you had been in touch with her, I believe, and she said, why don't you come with me? I think at that time you were at Cornell. No, you were at Yale, okay. And Madame de Menil said, we go with me, I'm going to meet this young African-American professor, and she was very impressed by Skip and by his family, and so she decided pretty much on the spot that she was going to try to fund some research that he was wanting to do. So that was really how, that was sort of the first I mean, there had been no specific plan to be associated with the university. So we had offices at Rice, but we weren't associated with Rice. But then over time they changed. Gave her a better option yet.
Yeah. It's really, Karen is key to the whole thing. I did my PhD dissertation on the relationship between race and reason in the 18th century. And I did it at the University of Cambridge. And I was hired as eventually an assistant professor in the program in Afro-American Studies in the English department. I had no money, no research support. I mean, John Blassingame couldn't even get research support. It was a whole different era. To get $50,000, you had to write hundreds of pages to the National Endowment and all, I mean, it was amazing. And I had no status. So there was the opening in '76 was in D.C., right? Mm-hmm. And I went to that. I don't know how I got there, but, I can't remember that part. But, I could see an opportunity when standing in front of me, right? So I sent her my PhD dissertation, hoping for a little support so I could transform it into a PhD thesis. And to my astonishment, she wrote me back and asked if she could come to Yale to visit. Mm. And my wife, Sharon Adams, and I had a little baby. And Karen and Madame de Menil came to town. And we were living in Timothy Dwight College, and we entertained them as best we could, right? And then she just sent me a check, agreement. She was going to support my research, I think for about 3 years, and then I got a MacArthur right after that. But she was the first person to give me support. And what I wanted to do, you see, I've always been more interested in racist images of black people in Western art. Because for every one image of a noble Negro, a noble African, there are 10,000 Ku Klux Klan, we call them Sambo images, right? And Paul put his finger on it. She had a theory that the Europeans, particularly the French, were less racist than Americans. So remember, she's in Houston. So she's basically trying to give them the finger, right? To say, we are the best among us, Europeans, the best of Western culture, has always responded to the nobility of Africans in a way that you people never did because of slavery, which is why the first volume on the Greco-Roman tradition was so important. And if you go back and really deconstruct the essays, I mean, particularly Frank Snowden, who was a leading black classicist of all time, trained at Harvard. He became dean at Howard, and he was so proper, and he had a kind of his own made-up New England accent. But all the black kids called him, and he had a sort of black shiny head, and all the black kids called him Apollo behind his back. But he writes his fairy tale in volume 1 about how the Greeks had no racism, and because they invented democracy and philosophy and, the Pythagorean theorem, and, the whole thing.
He wrote his first volume on this, and it was called Before Color Prejudice.
Yeah, Before Color
Right,
Prejudice.
yeah.
That if only we could have gone back to the Greeks, or if only the Greek tradition had survived, there never would have been racism or race-based, but it's total rubbish. And, I mean, no offense to the great, to Apollo, So I was really interested in this. But Ladislas Bugner, and I just did not get along. I mean, Karen it was like oil and water.
Absolutely. Right.
Because my motivation was completely, we had two disagreements. First of all, I was interested in negative images of black people. Secondly, I was interested in those images in literature. And Karen will remember, I had a site visit when they came, and I showed them file cabinets. That's why I'm so upset that stuff from the file cabinets is gone. We had a whole research team, meaning undergraduates and graduate students at Yale, going through periodicals looking for verbal and visual images of black people in a racist way. So they come to the second floor of 493 College Street at Yale, where Afro-Am was. And I had what was called the Black Periodical Literature Project. And I'm showing them file cabinets full of this stuff. And he interrupts. His wife was there, and you were there. And they were all talking. I was talking just like you were talking. It'd be as if Abby and I broke into a whole separate conversation with Cornell West with gesticulations, and I knew they were not amused, and I wanted to say, hey, I'm talking up here. And I knew he was saying, this is not what we want. We want a completely different kind of thing. So then I got a MacArthur, and I just moved on my own, right? And our relationship ended. Though I went down to the Rothko Chapel, and, I went to a couple cocktail parties with Madame de Menil, and, you and I remained, it was all friendly. But I just thought Ladislas was an asshole, and I hope history will record that. That was said by Henry Louis Gates Jr.
I can second that.
You the second that, right?
I had a meeting after I had written a dissertation about medieval and early Renaissance images of Africans in European art. And I had converted part of it into a book about the figure of the African wise man and the Adoration of the Magi story. And I had written an article or two, and I was sort of out of school finally, and my book was out, and so I made an appointment to go to Paris to visit the archive, because I had never used the archive. The archive was exclusively proprietal, and the idea being, and it makes sense, you've got a book project underway, you're going to keep your data until the book project is done. The only problem was the book project wasn't getting done.
No.
Right?
He didn't want it to get...
1976 was the ancient volume.
Right.
1979 were the two rather brilliant medieval volumes, which partly told me what I needed to know. But the Renaissance, the 1500, 1800 volumes, for a whole variety of reasons that we'd have to take a whole nother session to examine.
And you'd all be asleep.
Yeah, probably. Kind of broke down. So anyway, so I wrote to Ladislas Bugner, and he said, "Oh, come visit me." And I went. We went and we looked at the archive and these amazing binders. His set is now at the Warburg Institute in London. The set that was in Houston, it came to Harvard, where I have spent not just hours, but days and months hefting them, right? But I looked in the stuff, and I was kind of curious. There were things that hadn't appeared in some of the volumes. I wondered why. Found some things, couldn't find other things. But basically, what Ladislas Bugner told me was that he would be happy to let me use the archive as long as he could approve anything I decided to publish.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He didn't want the project to end.
Yeah.
He didn't want the project to end because it put him out of business.
Right.
Either consciously or subconsciously, it became true. But here's the end of the story, if I may, about how Houston moved to Harvard Square. Karen Dalton fell in love with the guy who lived in Boston. This is a true story. Two things happened. Independently, Karen Dalton fell in love with Todd Lee, an architect, Harvard man, and I was appointed the chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies and the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute.
This is called big time serendipity, right?
It was big time serendipity. So, as Cordell knows the story by heart, Neil Rudenstein, I was appointed, then a couple weeks later, Neil Rudenstein was appointed president. And he was vice president of the Mellon Foundation. And he invited me to come down. We sat out in the garden, and he told me just to fantasize about how to create the greatest center for the study of black people in the whole world. And I'm a fantasy meter. You gave me a legal pad, so I just fantasized. But one of the things I had learned from Yale as an undergraduate, which I started to attend in 1969, was that to be a great center for black studies, you need an archive. Yale opened the James Weldon Johnson collection in 1950, and I'm very proud of the fact that I have one of the original programs for that opening. So the first research paper I ever did, Cordell, my whole life, was on Bessie Smith in the Beinecke Rare Book Library, because they had the original pressings of the Columbia Bessie Smith story, those 4 albums, and all this correspondence of Langston Hughes, everything. It was amazing. And it was brought to Yale by Carl Van Vechten, okay? Harvard had zip. It was astonishing that in 1991, there were few things here, but Harvard had basically no archive. So I said to Neil Rudenstein, we need an archive. And I'm looking all the time for an archive for sale. We had thought about going down the University of Massachusetts and trying to buy from them the Du Bois paper.
They never would have let you do it, Skip.
Well, not
I'm a
only did we think about it, we tried. We offered them $1 million. No, I had a conversation with Du Bois' son. We offered them $1 million in cash. This has never been made public. This was all Neil Rudenstein's. We offered him, he said, go down there and offer him $1 million. So I met with David, offered him $1 million and a permanent fellowship at the Du Bois Institute in the same way we did for David Beinman. And his eyes, he was ready. He said, we're going to do that. The people at the University of Massachusetts lost their minds, especially the black nationalists in the department. I have never been invited to lecture at the University of Massachusetts. They went nuts. They went totally crazy.
I can get you.
Only if those guys are retired,
They have.
I thought it was a bold and clever move myself, but, it didn't work out. However, Madame de Menil then independently, this is the third serendipitous thing. By this time, she wanted to locate the archive at a university. Now, Peter Wood was at Duke, and her kids had gone to Harvard. And there's Duke, but there's Harvard, right? So she really wanted it to come to Harvard. And then Karen was coming here, so it was a natural. So I went to the president, went to the dean, and Henry Brasovsky was still the dean. I'm sorry for the length of this, but it's all a true story. And I just been hired, 6 weeks, and I'm going over there saying, we have to get this archive. And they're giving it to us. And I was so naive, I knew nothing about fundraising except for myself.
And you were a pro at that.
I was an apprentice, a journeyman, whatever. Man, not bad. So, but I knew nothing about how Harvard worked. So Karen was getting married. What date did you get married?
June the 1st, 1991.
June the 1st, 1990. Very important, because Henry Brasovsky's term as dean ended June 30th, 1991. He was replaced by Jeremy Knowles. So I wanted to give Karen, I use this as an excuse to push them along. I wanted to give Karen and Todd a wedding present. This letter from the dean authorizing that, the acceptance by Harvard University of the whole Image of the Black and Western Art Archive, okay? So I pressed them, and they said, okay, the deal is done. We're going to give you a sealed letter addressed to Karen Dalton, which you can then give to her at her wedding reception. So I went to this beautiful wedding in downtown Boston. She was so lovely in this beautiful white dress, and I couldn't get over it. And I thought, wow, I'm like Santa Claus. I'm bringing this letter. So I handed her the letter, and of course I didn't open it because it wasn't addressed to me. In a way, I wish I had, because if I'd seen the content, I wouldn't have really given it to her. Basically, because the content spoiled their whole wedding. But here's what the letter said. The letter said, Harvard University is delighted to accept the donation of the 26,000 images in the Image of the Black collection, as long as you raise an endowment of $3.6 million. I swear to God. So I handed it to her. I said, this is your wedding present. Her new husband's standing there. She opens it, and I think she burst into tears. I mean, almost. She didn't quite literally. I go, and her face turned red. She was crushed. And I go, what did they say? What? I just felt like an idiot. And I read, I go, holy shit, how am I going to raise $3.6 million? So, the end of the story, and I apologized, at the wedding, and I go, we're going to do this, we'll figure it out. I go, why did they set me up like this? And they explained to me when I called the dean the next day, and because he's my mentor, right? Yeah. He said, you can't, to take this seriously, everything that's given has to be endowed so that it's self-perpetuating. Sure. So you just got to do it. And this is your trial by fire. So I wrote to every foundation that you could believe, because I was determined to do this. We were determined to hire Cornell West. We wanted to hire William Joyce Wilson, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and I wanted this archive, which we had the right to if we could raise $3.6 million. So to make a long story short, New Year's Day, I get a phone call from the president of Harvard University. And my wife said, Neil Rudenstein's on the phone. And my heart leapt. I thought, holy mackerel, what did I do wrong? Why would the president be calling me, And I go, hello. And he said, oh, Angelica and I just want to wish you and Sharon Happy New Year. You have made a great beginning. How's fundraising going for the endowment for the Image of the Black? And I did what each of you did. I lied my ass off. I said, well, we have great prospects from maybe the Ford Foundation and the, whatever, and I'm thinking about doing this. I was tap dancing. And he said, fine. He said, I called you to tell you that an anonymous donor has just given you $1 million toward that endowment. And I said, really? And he said, yes. And he said, here's what I want you to do. This is New Year's Day. He said, wait 2 days, and I want you to call Dominique de Menil. And I want you to say, an anonymous donor has just put up $1 million on the condition that she matches the $1 million. And I said, I can't do that. He said, you can do it. And I said, what if she turns it down? And he said, she won't turn it down. So 2 days later, I called her in the squeaky voice, Madam de Menil. And basically said, I'll get back to you. And within hours, really, she matched the $1 million. So we had $2 million in 72 hours. We had raised $2 million. And then I was called in by the dean or the president, and they said, you know, you've done such a good job. We now think that you've raised enough money to endow the Image of the Black Project. And that is a true story. Isn't that a great story? You got it. And now that endowment is huge. I mean, think if you started with $2 million in 1991 or 1992, so there would be an Image of the Black forever, you know, and it's self-sustaining and it's got a huge principle. So anyway, but it's all because of you.
No, it's all because of you.
And I apologize for that letter.
I want to put that into context also of Dominique de Menil at the end of her life, because in those last years, she died in December 31st, 1997, she was running out of money. And it sounds surprising, you know, because they had such a great fortune, but first of all, they gave half their net worth to their children in the 60s. They gave each of them a trust fund. And then they bought a lot of art over the years. They built a lot of buildings, and you saw some of what they did with their money. And
they didn't fritter it away.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And she was giving it all to the museum afterwards, but in the later years, she, for example, the Carter Menil Human Rights Award was a hugely important initiative for her. And Jimmy Carter approached her around the same time and asked for $5 million to endow the Carter Menil Human Rights Award in perpetuity, and she said no. And it was only really late in the research that I was able to get an exact figure for how much money Dominique de Menil had at the end of her life, and it was $78 million in cash and stocks, not the value of the art or real estate or anything else, but $78 million that was going to the museum. And she had a lot of projects that she was committed to, and you know, $5 million, $78 million sounds like a lot. I'm sure any of us would be happy with having that amount, but she had she was committed to a lot of projects, and so $5 million when you only have 78 is a lot, you know, and in the same way $1 million was a lot there, and I think that it speaks to how important this project was to Dominique de Menil, that she would commit to it at that level of funding, so.
Well, and then we had to persuade somebody to do a new edition. So all these presses would say, you see, she paid for the original volumes, printing and everything, the paper. Harvard just distributed the volumes, but the volumes really were independently produced. And so when I went to all these, because it was no good just having the archive, we wanted to finish it, because it hadn't been finished, right, and then do new editions. So huge, I mean, I would say, get responses. Yes, we will do this, and now you got to raise another $5 million. I mean, it was a lot of money. And the second hero of the piece is Sharmila Sen, who was my colleague in the English department. She was a Yalie like me, just published a memoir. Beautiful memoir. And she called me one day, and she said, you know, I think she's now an editor at the Harvard University Press, and she said, I want to take this on. I think that we can persuade him to do it. And I said, I cannot raise money for the ink and the color and the. She goes, no, we're going to do this as a commercial proposition. Are you on board? And she said, you have to be on the cover. You know, your name has to be there. You have to be involved. Yeah. And I said, I want to do it with David Beinman. You know, who's the right person. Yeah. And that's the history of that. And then we cranked it out, and now we're in 11 volumes. We're, I think, editing the 11th or the 12th, and now it's on the Image of the Black in Latin America. Mm-hmm. But so there are angels here. You know, Rudenstein was an angel. Brasovsky was an angel. And Rudenstein, the anonymous donor, turned out to be Neil Rudenstein. He just took it from his discretionary funds as president. Isn't that amazing?
It gives me goosebumps.
Me too. It's the whole thing is a miracle, and I was just an actor in a complex drama, and I feel very privileged that I was able to play that role. But it wasn't this brilliant scheme. I mean, I was improvising all the time.
Tap dance.
Tap dance, because I knew it was important. Yeah. And not only did Harvard, then the Image of the Black become Harvard's first major archive, but as Florence Ladd knows, the Schlesinger had begun to acquire papers, Dorothy West paper, and I can't remember the chronology. But then we had enough body that what's now called the Hutchins Center, and the Du Bois Institute in the Hutchins Center, would be proactive. So we put up money to buy. We would split the costs with the library, with Widener or Houghton or the Schlesinger. And, you know, we have Albert Murray's papers, some Baraka papers, Susie Laurie Park's papers, Angela Davis's papers, Mrs. Du Bois's papers, you know, June Jordan's papers. So all that was all part of the strategy to try to, you know, create a great center for African American studies. But it started with you and your marriage with Todd. I don't know what would have happened if you'd have fallen in love with some white boy down in the South, in Georgia, Mississippi or something. Whole history of...
Well, you know, it turned out that Todd had gone to the same prep school as Madame de Menil's son, Georges. And so it's really strange.
Maybe we should open it up and see if there are other questions, especially for William.
Yes.
At this point, I've got a few, but let's see what we find out there first.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk and introduction, at least for me, introduction to the subject matter. I was really struck by the images you showed about halfway through your presentation of the one of the showings, one of the gallery viewings with all of those residents from Houston, but in particular, you know, Black children walking through the gallery, touching, in some cases touching, I don't know if they're supposed to be touching, but touching the artwork, pointing it out. You know, there's that one great image of it looks like the little girl and perhaps her father or guardian, or the three little boys who are wearing dashikis and pointing at the statue like, whoa. And I was wondering if, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the agenda in terms of proving to, you know, proving or exalting Black art in the Western world and saying this deserves or this is on the same level. But was there an agenda in exposing that artwork to residents of Houston, including Black residents of Houston? So I was wondering if you could, if there is something to talk about, if you could talk about that just a little bit. And then I was also wondering if you could talk a little about the family's beliefs or understanding of Black contemporary art in, say, the age of Harlem Renaissance or moving forward. I know you mentioned in the 60s and 70s they did work with some contemporary artists, but there's also this longer, you know, African-American trajectory of great artists who are getting accolades or being sponsored, who are doing, you know, paintings and things like that prior to the period. And I was wondering if you could talk, you know, do they have an interest? Do they collect some of that artwork? Do they own any of it? If so, you know, maybe talk a little bit about that. If not, is it, you know, why not?
Okay, sure. Yes, I do think that, you know, as Professor Gates was saying, that you know, nobility was an important point for the Image of the Black project and for everything that they were doing. One of the things that Dominique wrote, or actually one of the things that she said in an interview later, was great masters who had treated the subjects with Blacks like the Three Kings or the baptism of the eunuch had depicted them as having great dignity and beauty. There was a message that had to be relayed. So perhaps it's misguided, but that was her intention. You know, she did want to show the nobility of African American artists and of depictions of non-Western art. In terms of the Harlem and African American artists, yes, they were collecting African American artists starting in the 60s. They have some photography from sort of the Harlem Renaissance. It was not I can't say there was a great concentration of the collection, but they were definitely collecting it. But another element that I didn't really talk about today is the kind of personal connection. You know, it's like there were so many ways that they were well, there are two elements of this. First of all, the Menils were never involved in an initiative. I think the image of the Black might be somewhat different because she did write an introduction to the first volume. Her foundation did pay for the production. But they never put themselves before a project. You know, they never had this intention to make it about them. You know, it was always about supporting projects that they believed in, but staying firmly in the background. You know, the Deluxe show, there's no mention of the Menils. You know, I have that picture of Jean with the artist, but that it wasn't seen as the Menils Deluxe show. You know, it was seen as the Deluxe show. Right. You know, and so many things were like that. There's someone in Houston named Deloyd Parker who has a community center called the Shape Community Center, and he's an African American who, you know, sort of African, pro-African activist, and he met John de Menil in the 60s, and he was at the house, and he was talking with him, and he said sort of for his development as an activist, it would be important for him to see Africa eventually, and he didn't think very much about it. It was just a comment that he made, and then several weeks later, he had a call from John's assistant with a check funding a month-long trip to Africa for him and his wife, and it was a life-changing event for him, and I asked him, I said, were there, you know, a lot of other people doing this sort of thing in Houston? And he goes, not rich white men from River Oaks, you know.
And he did the same thing with Mickey.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey Leland, and there were a lot of people. There were.
People don't know who Mickey Leland is anymore.
Sure. Okay, yeah, Mickey Leland was this incredible figure. Who was a student at TSU, Texas Southern University. Jean de Menil went to the dean and said, are there any young students who you think are particularly promising? And he said, well, there's this guy in the pharmacy, he's studying pharmacy. His name is Mickey Leland. And, you know, he was a pretty extravagant kind of guy with a big fro and kind of, you know, fancy, I mean, he had a real vibe, this guy, Mickey Leland.
He was charismatic.
Oh yeah, super charismatic. and John de Menil just immediately, you know, understood that he was someone, you know, extraordinary, and so he helped him. But again, you know, and Mickey Leland always, there's some, I wish I had the book in front of me, I could read you some of the things, but he's like, Mickey Leland was so appreciative of the support of John de Menil, but again, it wasn't, John de Menil never put himself out front. It was never about, you know, I'm presenting you Mickey Leland. It's, you know, I'm helping you become the person you can be, right? And on John de Menil's last birthday, actually, in 1973, January 1973, Mickey Leland always wore this really thick chain around his neck that symbolized the chains of slavery, and he gave John de Menil a link from that chain for his birthday, and he said that it was a symbol of him having helped him release him from his chains, right? And Mickey Leland became a congressman from first a state congressman, and then a U.S. congressman from Texas, and he was making a tour of Africa in the 1980s and died in an airplane crash. But we were just saying earlier that, you know, it's not inconceivable that he could have been the first sort of African American president. I mean, he was a very dynamic figure. So that's a little about Mickey Leland.
They almost had a father-son relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I want to thank you for this extraordinary panel and this contribution to the history that we all, I hope, have taken in about how this archive came to this university. My question, though, is about the offspring of the de Menils. Have they carried on an interest in image of the Black?
Yes, definitely. In fact, Susan and Francois de Menil, Francois is an architect and Susan de Menil is his wife, and it was actually Susan and Francois who first suggested the idea of doing something here because they believe so strongly in the project and know how important the civil rights engagement was to the de Menils. The children all live in New York. I mean, they're in their 70s and 80s now, but I still think of them as the children. But they are all collectors, and they are all involved in different ways. You know, the children are not the parents. They don't have the same means as the parents. And you know, I think a big reason why Dominique and Jean de Menil did what they did is, for me, there's no question that they would not have done what they did in terms of collecting, in terms of much of their engagement with civil rights, had they not found themselves in Houston, Texas. Mm-hmm. You know, they found themselves in a city that had no cultural context. You know, they came from Paris. They had been raised there, and Paris in the 1930s is, I think, one of the most exciting moments in sort of art history. And they arrived in the city that had nothing, you know, essentially nothing, and they sort of took a look around and said, let's do something about that, you know. And I don't think they would, if they had been in New York, I think they would have become collectors, they would have been involved with artists, but there wasn't the kind of urgent need that there was in a city like Houston.
Well, I think also Jean de Menil was a rebel.
Right.
I mean, he really liked to cause trouble. I mean, there was a real activist in him, I think, and it was the kind of thing he could really take that bit into his mouth and really, you know, and his support of Mickey Leland was, you know, so solid, and he recognized in Mickey great talent and possibilities.
Absolutely. Jean de Menil was paying for, there were some sit-ins in Houston in the 1950s. Jean de Menil was paying for the defense. There was, in 1965, I believe, there was something at TSU that a riot, supposedly, that was really caused by the police, and 5 African Americans were arrested, and they became known as the TSU 5. And Jean de Menil paid for their legal defense. He paid because the trial was off in Victoria, Texas, and he paid for buses to transport people from Houston to the trial. And it was all done behind the scenes. You know, it wasn't about taking credit for this. It was all done in a very discreet way.
But I mean, there was sort of you know, certain kinds of lines that had to be walked there. Like, I was particularly fascinated by the section where you talk about how the image of the Black Project was spun off from any affiliation with the sort of museum thrust, because of a fear that it would, I guess this was the Museum of Fine Arts at this point, or the Museum of Contemporary Art, I'm not remembering which one, but that had to be separate because it was perceived that the museum development would be adversely affected by the existence of the image of the Black and Western Art Project.
Absolutely. They hired someone in 1960 in Paris, and then they also worked with the director of that museum shortly after Totems Not Taboo, that great exhibition. And he's sending letters around, the director of the museum, James Johnson Sweeney, to museums around the world asking for images of Blacks. And then they're starting to gather them. They have all this information, and then it's starting to get too big and too controversial, because suddenly you have this whole very traditional museum in a very conservative city, and then what is all of this? You know, and so the de Menils realized that it was best to separate it, in the same way that Dominique realized that it was best to keep the Rothko Chapel away from the Menil collection, you know, because all the activities at the Rothko Chapel were a little too radical, you know, for the support that they hoped to have for the museum. And there were some people who said, there was someone who gave $5 million to the building of the museum. He said, you know, they didn't love all the things that went on at the chapel, meaning all of the civil rights and human rights things, but they loved Dominique, and they loved what she was doing for the city, and they gave $5 million for the museum. Yeah. So it's an example, I think, of the difficult context in the South.
Yeah.
Just, if I may, let me qualify the critique. You know, when I talked about their romanticism about or the fantasy of a Europe, particularly the European aristocracy, being above racism, which we know is absolutely not true. But it also served as a political allegory in America at the beginning of the middle of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. Because when is Jean commissioning those 2 photographers to take 60, 61, right? So even to pretend that there was a tradition that was beyond racism or before racism, for a project based in Houston, Texas, in the middle of the modern civil rights movement, was an amazing political statement.
Right.
I mean, it was a way of them putting down racist Americans and saying there was a time, you know, there were better times, and finding, you know, black kings and black saints. That's astonishing. I remember the first time I couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it sometimes.
I just want to stress.
So I didn't want to be anyone to think I was poo-pooing what they were doing. It was
Right,
important.
Right. I understand.
I just want to stress, you know, the earlier part of their lives, both Jean and Dominique, are so caught up in religion. You know, different flavors very much. You know, initially a kind of reactionary Catholicism on his part. But then there's this whole fascinating section within the book about Father Couturier and their association with a kind of modernist Catholic theologian and thinker who brings them to the art world, but there's also a sense there that it brings them ethically into a much more progressive place. And so if you look at the most of the earlier volumes of the Image of the Black and Western Art series, you're going to see a tremendous number of images of Christian art, which of course reflects the medieval period, among other things, but even in the later the And I think that that sacred imagery connects both to the ethical positions and it connects to the European roots and to the particular family roots of both of them. And in the case of Dominique, it's a little ironic because, of course, the Protestant tradition is actually more iconoclastic. It doesn't like that kind of representation very much. But she kind of transcends that at a certain point.
You know, she and I went to Brazil together. And she had become quite interested. There was a group in became very interested in candomblé,
Right.
and was supporting a priest who was working there with the black community, and you know, she was right there. You know, she was extraordinarily open. Extraordinarily open.
And radical in
Absolutely.
some of her engagements, you know, in a way that, like Oscar Romero was someone who she named a prize after at the Rothko Chapel, and so interesting for me to see that he's just been given sainthood, you know, because he was someone who was super controversial when they were supporting him in the 70s.
Yeah.
And
But she had a sense of humor too. I remember, to my amazement, Karen told me about a comment which I cannot repeat here that she made in passing about the representation of sexuality, shall we say, in an African sculpture. I went like, oh my God, you know, like,
She said what?
that old lady's more interesting than I thought.
Well, on that note, before we go over,
she definitely had a sense of humor, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we need to wrap up. But before I finally thank William again for bringing all this to us, I want to point out that there are copies of the book over there. I'm sure he would be happy to sign them. And I urge you to have a look at it. It's extremely absorbing.
Thank you.
So thanks very much.
Please give it up
Thank you,
for
William. It's amazing. Thank you.
all. Karen, it was fabulous.
You were, what a great contribution. Thank you so much.
No, it was great.
It was terrific.
The stories are true.
Yeah, great. No, I thought it was great.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.